Mark the Fixer O'Donnell, Liam Ghost Harris, and Dean the Banker Kelly were ordinary men living ordinary lives in Liverpool, until ambition and greed turned them into the most feared cocaine lords the city had ever seen. Behind pubs, garages, and quiet terraced houses, they built an empire worth millions, moving drugs with military precision while the city slept. But the higher they climbed, the more dangerous the shadows became, and soon, loyalty, betrayal, and murder would threaten to destroy everything they had built. Liverpool had always been a city of contrasts. Its skyline told stories of triumph and decline, with historic docks standing beside crumbling warehouses, and bustling streets giving way to quiet, narrow alleys. The city had survived economic hardship, riots, and waves of migration, yet beneath the surface of everyday life, a darker story was quietly taking shape. By the early 2000s, the whispers began, rumors of cocaine moving through the city's ports, whispers that seemed too ambitious to be true. Yet, as the years would reveal, those whispers were only the beginning of a transformation that would shake Liverpool to its core. It started small. A few local men, ordinary in appearance with ordinary jobs, began to see an opportunity that others had overlooked. Some ran small garages, fixing cars in industrial estates. Others owned pubs in quiet neighborhoods, their lives unremarkable except for ambition. They had no criminal pedigree, no history of violence, but they had an understanding of the city that law enforcement did not. They knew the streets, the docks, and the invisible networks that allowed goods and people to move unnoticed, and they were about to use that knowledge to build something extraordinary. The docks of Liverpool had long been a gateway to the world. Ships arrived from South America, Africa, and Europe, carrying legitimate cargo, fruit, textiles, machinery, but hidden within the containers, unnoticed by customs inspectors, cocaine began to flow. At first the shipments were small, almost symbolic, a few kilograms here and there, but the operation quickly scaled. The men were careful, learning from each shipment, perfecting methods to avoid detection. They discovered that the key to survival was invisibility, blending in with ordinary port traffic, keeping a low profile, and avoiding the flamboyant displays of wealth that often draw attention. Within a few years, the small network that had started with a handful of men had grown into an empire. Liverpool's quiet streets, lined with Victorian terraces and industrial estates, had become the backbone of one of the most lucrative cocaine operations in the United Kingdom. The scale was staggering. Thousands of kilograms were moving through the city every year, generating millions of pounds in profit. For the men involved, the wealth was transformative, but it was also intoxicating in another way. A sense of power, of control over a city that had once seemed indifferent to their existence. The rise of the Mersey Kings, as they would later be called, was marked by careful planning and a ruthless understanding of risk. They avoided unnecessary violence, preferring negotiation, threats, and intimidation to maintain control. Their operations were systematic, almost military in precision. Each member had a role, each shipment a schedule, and every step was calculated to reduce exposure. What made them extraordinary, however, was not just their organization, but their ambition. They did not see themselves as street-level criminals. They saw themselves as entrepreneurs, building a business that in their minds could not fail. And yet, the story of their rise was not without tension. Rival gangs and opportunistic criminals lurked nearby, eager to exploit weaknesses, and law enforcement began to notice patterns in shipping routes and distribution networks. But even as the first investigations began, the Mersey Kings remained several steps ahead. They operated in shadows, carefully managing the city's perception and creating an aura of untouchability. Liverpool's streets, which had once seemed mundane, were quietly being transformed into the arteries of a cocaine empire. What shocked observers most was the speed of their ascent. In a matter of a few years, these local men had built an operation that rivaled London and Manchester's criminal networks. The city that had once been defined by its docks and football clubs was now gaining a reputation for something far more dangerous. Behind the ordinary facades of garages, pubs, and industrial units, an empire had risen, a criminal machine that promised wealth, power, and control, but also carried a growing threat of violence and betrayal. And as Liverpool's cocaine kings expanded their reach, the city itself was about to be forced to reckon with the consequences of ambition unbound. Success for the Mersey Kings was not just about money, it was about control. By the mid-2000s, their empire had grown to dominate Liverpool's cocaine trade, stretching across neighborhoods, into nearby towns, and even linking to contacts abroad. But with growth came a new challenge, keeping the organization intact while fending off rivals and avoiding the ever-watchful eyes of law enforcement. To survive, the Kings developed a code, an unspoken set of rules that governed every action, every decision, and every relationship within the organization. Loyalty was the first rule. No matter how small a role someone played, betrayal was unthinkable. The Kings knew that trust was fragile in the criminal world, and even a single leak could bring down months of planning. Violence, when it was necessary, was precise and strategic. Hits were carried out to send a clear message without drawing unnecessary attention. Unlike other gangs that flaunted their power with flashy cars and open gun battles, the Mersey Kings were careful, almost clinical. They cultivated fear silently, through whispered stories, sudden disappearances, and carefully orchestrated warnings. But perhaps the most surprising element of their strategy was their invisibility. Unlike many criminal networks that drew attention through ostentatious displays of wealth, the Kings blended into Liverpool's ordinary life. Luxury cars were registered under the names of family members or offshore companies. Expensive properties were hidden behind the facades of legitimate businesses. Even when the money was there, it was rarely flaunted. To an outsider, they appeared as ordinary men, bar owners counting cash at the end of the night, garage mechanics repairing engines in dusty workshops. Their true influence remained hidden in plain sight. The city itself began to feel the subtle changes. Neighborhoods that had been quiet for decades suddenly experienced bursts of violence. But it was carefully contained. Rival gangs testing the King's territory often disappeared overnight, leaving others to whisper about what had happened. The cocaine trade became an invisible force flowing through Liverpool's streets and alleys, shaping the city in ways few could see but everyone could feel. Even so, cracks began to appear. Rival gangs, sensing opportunity, began probing the edges of the King's territory. Small confrontations erupted, sometimes violent, sometimes resolved through intimidation. The Kings responded with a mixture of calculated force and psychological strategy, leaving their rivals unsure whether to retreat or risk crossing them. Each move was deliberate, a calculated dance of power where one misstep could be fatal. The most shocking element of this chapter in their rise, however, was how quickly fear became respect. Ordinary citizens, unaware of the full scope of the empire, sensed the silent power lurking behind Liverpool's streets. The Kings were not merely dealers, they were rulers, manipulating an invisible kingdom with the precision of chess masters. And yet, there was always an underlying tension. Every shipment, every deal, and every encounter carried the risk of exposure. One wrong move could ignite chaos within the organization, or bring the full force of law enforcement crashing down. Behind closed doors, the King's meetings were tense affairs. Plans were drawn with military precision, each member aware of the stakes. They discussed shipments, routes, and contacts, but always with a keen awareness that betrayal could be just one whispered conversation away. The tension was relentless, a constant undercurrent that shaped decisions, alliances, and even friendships. Survival required more than cunning, it required constant vigilance, and even that was no guarantee. By the end of this period, Liverpool had changed. Streets, docks, and industrial estates had become the veins of a cocaine empire that was growing stronger and more organized by the year. The city was under the rule of men who operated in shadows, whose wealth and power were both invisible and terrifying. Their code maintained order in a world defined by danger, but it was a fragile order. One misstep, one betrayal, one careless move could unravel everything. And as the Mersey Kings tightened their grip, the city stood on the edge of a new, uncertain chapter. one that would test both their ambition and their loyalty in ways no one could have imagined. By 2010, the Mersey Kings had reached a point that many thought impossible. Their empire stretched across Liverpool and beyond, linking the docks to neighborhoods, towns, and even European cities. Cocaine shipments moved with a precision that rivaled any legitimate business, generating millions of pounds in profit every year. The men who had started as ordinary garage workers, pub owners, and street-level dealers now ruled a criminal kingdom that few dared to challenge. To outsiders, they seemed untouchable, an invisible force shaping the city from the shadow. Yet the higher the empire rose, the more fragile it became. The first cracks appeared in the most unexpected way. A low-level courier arrested for a minor drug possession charge. At the time, law enforcement treated it as routine, assuming the courier was insignificant. But when investigators searched his belongings, they discovered encrypted messages hinting at something much larger. It was a small, almost invisible thread that when pulled would unravel the entire network. As the police began piecing together the connections, the first wave of paranoia struck the organization. Shipments were delayed, contacts questioned, and trust within the ranks began to erode. What had once been a disciplined and loyal group now started to fracture under pressure. Members feared betrayal, and even minor mistakes could trigger violent retribution. The very code that had kept them strong was now strained to the breaking point. The domino effect was swift. Arrests and investigations forced the Kings to rely on less experienced operatives, increasing the chances of errors. Rival gangs sensed vulnerability and began testing the boundaries of the Mersey Kings' territory. Shipments were hijacked, threats escalated, and the invisible power that had once commanded fear now faced challenges from both within and without. Each attack, each disruption, set off a chain reaction that threatened to collapse the empire entirely. The surprising twist was that the organization's downfall did not come solely from law enforcement or rivals. Internal betrayal proved to be the deadliest weapon. Trusted lieutenants, once considered loyal, began selling information to police and competitors. Fear and greed turned allies into enemies overnight. The consequences enormous. Millions of pounds worth of cocaine, hidden stashes, and secret properties became points of vulnerability. The city that had once whispered about the Kings now watched with a mixture of fear and curiosity as the empire teetered. Liverpool's streets, so long under the quiet rule of the Kings, were suddenly alive with tension, uncertainty, and rumor. In private, the leaders attempted to salvage their power. New strategies were devised, stricter loyalty tests were imposed, and violent retaliation was carefully planned. Yet, the cracks were deepening too quickly. The courier's arrest had set off a chain reaction that no amount of planning could fully contain. What had seemed invincible now appeared precarious, and every decision carried deadly consequences. By the end of this period, the Mersey Kings were still powerful, but their empire was no longer unassailable. The dominoes had begun to fall, and there was no stopping the cascade. Internal betrayals, rival encroachment, and police investigations combined to create a pressure cooker situation. The very methods that had allowed them to rise, their code, secrecy, and careful control, now limited their options and amplified their risks. The empire's peak had arrived, but it was fleeting. The men who had once controlled Liverpool's streets now faced an uncomfortable truth. Power, no matter how meticulously built, is fragile. And as the first dominoes toppled, the foundations of the Mersey Kings' kingdom began to crumble, setting the stage for an inevitable collapse that would shock the city and leave scars that could never fully heal. As the investigations intensified, the Mersey Kings found themselves trapped in a shrinking world. The city that had once been their playground, the docks, the alleys, the pubs, now felt like a maze, each corner a potential trap. Meetings that had once been routine became tense, conducted in hidden locations, in abandoned warehouses, or inside the backs of delivery trucks. Every shipment was scrutinized, every courier questioned, and every contact tested for loyalty. The empire that had once thrived on secrecy now struggled to protect itself from the very shadows it had once commanded. Internal betrayal became the organization's deadliest threat. Trusted lieutenants, some of whom had grown up alongside the leaders, began selling information. Motivations varied, some acted out of fear, others for money, and a few for revenge over perceived slights. The code that had once held the kings together, the rules of loyalty and obedience, was now being weaponized against them. Friendships were shattered overnight, and the invisible threads that had maintained control started snapping one by one. Police operations moved with precision. Surveillance teams monitored docks, warehouses, and residential areas. Undercover officers infiltrated distribution networks, and high-tech methods were used to intercept communications. The arrest of low-level couriers had revealed the tip of an iceberg, and investigators worked tirelessly to follow the threads to the top. Each raid uncovered hidden cash, kilograms of cocaine, and evidence linking the leaders to an empire that had once seemed untouchable. Rival gangs seized the moment. Where the kings had once moved with quiet confidence, rivals now acted openly, hijacking shipments and taking over territory that had long been controlled without challenge. Violence erupted in previously calm neighborhoods, with drive-by attacks and sudden disappearances spreading fear throughout the city. What had been an orderly criminal empire now appeared chaotic, a machine breaking down under pressure from every direction. Even the leaders themselves were not safe. Some were arrested in dramatic raids, their homes surrounded in the dead of night by police armed with warrants. Others escaped capture but became fugitives, constantly moving between safe houses, never staying in one place long enough to regain a sense of control. The carefully constructed illusion of untouchability shattered, leaving the kings exposed and vulnerable. The shocking reality was that some of the most dangerous moments came not from outside forces but from within. Members who had once been loyal now carried secrets that could destroy entire operations. Paranoia became pervasive. Every meeting was approached with caution. Every conversation weighed for hidden motives. Even family ties were questioned, and the bonds that had once been unbreakable were now strained to their limits. The empire that had relied on trust and discipline was collapsing under the weight of suspicion and fear. By the end of this period, the Mersey Kings' power was in freefall. Millions in cash and cocaine were seized, and key leaders faced lengthy prison sentences. The streets of Liverpool, once dominated by an invisible empire, were left in a state of cautious calm, the echoes of violence and betrayal lingering like ghosts. The docks, warehouses, and alleyways that had been the backbone of the empire were empty, silent witnesses to the end of an era. Yet, even as the organization crumbled, the story was not entirely over. Some leaders vanished, slipping into the shadows, leaving questions about their fate unanswered. Their escape became part of the legend, a reminder that even in defeat, power can linger, unseen and unpredictable. Liverpool had survived the reign of the Mersey Kings. But the scars remained, etched into neighborhoods, whispered in alleys, and remembered in the quiet tension of a city that had glimpsed the rise and fall of a criminal empire unlike any other. Today, Liverpool remembers the Mersey Kings, though much of their empire has vanished. The city bears the scars of their reign, families broken, communities shaken, and neighborhoods, once dominated by fear, slowly reclaiming their streets. The docks, warehouses, and industrial estates that were once the lifeblood of their operation now stand quiet, shadows of the past. But the story of the Mersey Kings is not just history, it is a cautionary tale, a reminder of how ambition and greed can transform ordinary people into figures of power and terror. The remnants of the empire linger, hidden in subtle ways. Investigators uncovered secret stashes of cash, abandoned safe houses, and shell companies that concealed the king's assets. Yet some mysteries remain unresolved. A handful of leaders disappeared without a trace, slipping away just as law enforcement closed in. Their fate is unknown, and their possible return has become a silent threat, a ghost, hanging over the city. Rumors persist, whispered in bars and alleyways, suggesting that the empire never fully ended, only transformed. For the people of Liverpool, the impact was both visible and invisible. Streets that had once echoed with the quiet control of the kings now carry traces of their influence in unexpected ways. Local gangs have studied the rise and fall of the Mersey Kings, learning from their methods and mistakes. They have adapted, attempting to replicate the organization's efficiency while avoiding the errors that led to its downfall. In this sense, the Mersey Kings live on, not as rulers, but as a blueprint, a lesson in power, secrecy, and ambition. The human cost of the empire is harder to measure. Families lost sons, brothers and fathers to addiction, violence, or incarceration. Communities that had once relied on loyalty and mutual trust were fractured, replaced with suspicion and fear. The psychological shadow of the king's reign persists, a reminder that power, no matter how carefully constructed, leaves consequences far beyond the individuals who wield it. For some, the empire is a memory of wealth and danger. For others, it is a wound that refuses to heal. Yet, there is a chilling final twist. Even after the fall of the Mersey Kings, the city feels their presence. The docks remain, silent witnesses to the empire that once flowed through them. Some of the vanished leaders are rumored to have survived, possibly abroad or in hiding, quietly observing. The new generation of criminals, ambitious and ruthless, watches the old empire as a guide. The lessons of loyalty, secrecy, and audacity are studied, whispered, and repeated. Liverpool may have moved on in daily life, but beneath the surface, the legacy of the Mersey Kings continues to shape the city's criminal underworld. In the end, the story of the Mersey Kings is one of power and fragility. They rose from ordinary men with extraordinary ambition, built a kingdom of fear and wealth, and fell in ways that were both dramatic and inevitable. Their empire changed the city, leaving a mark that cannot be erased. And while many of the kings faced justice, a few vanished into shadows, leaving questions unanswered and possibilities open. Liverpool stands as a city that survived the rise and fall of a criminal empire. Yet the echoes of its reign remind all who live there that ambition unchecked, loyalty broken, and secrets kept can shape a city for generations. The docks may be quiet now, the warehouses empty, and the streets calmer, but the ghosts of the Mersey Kings are still there, hidden in the shadows, waiting. Their story is over, but the city and those who remember cannot forget.